My name is Elena, and for 25 years I was the most feared judge in our city. I live in a coastal region, a place where the sea crashes furiously against the cliffs and where fog seems to permanently cling to the streets. It's a grey, humid, and beautiful city in its own way, but harsh. The climate forces you to be resilient, and I became part of that landscape. My life was the courtroom. I put on my black robe every morning like someone donning armor. I liked the weight of the fabric on my shoulders. I liked the sound of the wooden gavel clanging on the table. I liked, above all, having the power to decide the fate of others. In my courtroom, I was the supreme authority. There was no room for God, only for the law and my interpretation of it. I saw hundreds of people pass before my bench. I saw murderers, thieves, swindlers, but I also saw good people who had made a stupid mistake. I looked at them all with the same indifference. To me, they weren't human beings with souls. They were files, paper and ink that I had to archive. I remember many mothers crying in the back pews, praying softly, begging Jesus for mercy. That irritated me deeply. I thought they were ignorant, people clinging to fantasies because they didn't have the courage to face reality. Sometimes I'd overhear people in the hallways talking about testimonies of hell or about someone who'd had a supernatural experience, and I felt utter intellectual contempt. For me, death was the end, just a blackout. The idea of eternal life seemed to me like a consolation invented by the poor to endure misery. How wrong I was, how arrogant I was, but there was another part of me that no one in the court knew, a part one kept locked away, because I felt it didn't fit with my image of an iron woman. When I got home, after handing down sentences that destroyed families or imprisoned men for decades, I needed to calm my nerves. I didn't like alcohol, and pills made me sluggish. My therapy was thread, and the needle. In the basement of my house, an old mansion I'd inherited from my parents facing the sea, I had a fully equipped workshop. There, the fierce judge disappeared and the seamstress was born. My spiritual life was as empty as a courtroom after a trial. I had no time for God. I had no time for questions about the soul. My God was my career, my reputation, and my intellect. I felt untouchable. I had money, I had power, I had health. What more could I need? The word salvation wasn't in my vocabulary. For me, being saved meant winning a case or avoiding a public scandal. I didn't understand that my soul was slowly rotting beneath the silk robes and good manners. I clearly remember the weeks leading up to my accident. The atmosphere in the city was heavier than usual, the storms were constant, and the sea roared with a violence that rattled the windows of my house. I felt restless and irritable. I started having insomnia. I would go down to my sewing workshop at 3 a.m., trying to sew, but my hands would tremble. I would tie knots where they shouldn't be. I would prick my fingers with the needle until they bled and stare at the drop of red blood on the white cloth, feeling an emptiness in my stomach that I couldn't explain. Now I know it was a warning. I firmly believe that before a tragedy occurs, the spirit senses the approach of death, but I was too deaf to hear. I was too busy being important. One day, an elderly woman approached me as I was leaving the courthouse. She was small, dressed in humble, worn clothes. The security guards tried to push her away, but she broke free with surprising strength and looked me straight in the eyes. I will never forget that look. There was no hatred, only infinite sadness. Judge Elena told me in a soft voice, "The justice of men is blind, but the justice of God sees everything. Beware of pride. The abyss is closer than you think. Seek Jesus Christ while he may be found." I paused for a moment. I felt a chill, but my pride reacted immediately. I straightened up, adjusted my expensive leather bag, and replied in my best tone of contempt, "Madame, save your sermons for church. Here, the law rules, not fairy tales." I got into my car and closed the door, isolating myself from her. I saw her in the rearview mirror as I drove away. She stood there in the drizzle, looking at me with pity. That image haunted me all day. It bothered me that someone so insignificant that she dared to pity me, a powerful woman. What did she know about life? What did she know about success? That night the unease was unbearable. I went down to the basement. I had a black velvet dress I was trying to mend. It was a difficult, slippery fabric, While I was sewing, the machine jammed, the thread became tangled in an impossible tangle. I pulled hard, frustrated, and the needle broke, jumping toward my face and grazing my cheek. It was a tiny cut, but I was frightened. I froze, staring at the broken machine. Suddenly, I had a strange thought, unfamiliar to me. I thought of a snake's skin. I don't know why. I'd never liked reptiles, I'd never even thought about them. But as I touched the black velvet of the dress, my mind conjured up the image of a snake shedding its skin, an old skin falling away to reveal something new but dangerous. I shook the thought out of my head, blaming it on exhaustion. You need a vacation, Elena, I told myself aloud. My voice sounded hollow in the cold basement. I didn't know my vacation would be a trip to the most horrible place there is. I didn't know that feeling of discomfort was my soul screaming, crying for help before the impact. Today I understand why there are so many shocking testimonies online and in churches. It's not because people want fame. On the contrary, telling this story is shameful. It's painful to lay yourself bare before the world and admit that you were lost, that you were bad, that you deserved the punishment. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but I do it because the truth burns if you keep it to yourself, and because I know there are many like me out there, successful people, professionals, people with 2 degrees, with big houses and new cars who think they're safe, people who view these issues with skepticism. I want to talk to you, the one who thinks you're a good person because you don't kill or steal. I used to think that too. I was a judge, I represented the goodness of society, I defended order, but my heart was full of idols. I was my own idol, and pride is a sin that blinds you so much that you don't realize you're walking toward the precipice until your feet are already in the air. That fateful week, I had to deliver a verdict in a high-profile case. A young man had been accused of fraud at a major company. The evidence was circumstantial, weak. Deep down, as a legal expert, I knew there was a huge amount of reasonable doubt. I knew that the right thing to do, the just thing to do, was to acquit him or at least order a more thorough investigation. But there was political pressure, there were powerful people who wanted a quick conviction to close the chapter and appease the investors, and I wanted a promotion to the state Supreme Court. That promotion depended on me showing a firm hand, it depended on my hand not trembling. So I made my decision days before the final judgment. I was going to condemn him. I was going to sacrifice that boy's life to pave my way to success. I convinced myself that he was surely guilty of something else, that he wasn't an innocent dove. I rationalized my evil. I disguised it as duty. That night, the night of after the accident, I stayed in my office until late, drafting the ruling. Outside, the storm had reached its peak. The wind howled as if the city was screaming. When I finished writing, I signed the document with my favorite fountain pen. I looked at my signature, elegant, firm, authoritative. I felt powerful, I felt invincible. I gathered my things, put on my coat, and went out to the parking lot. My car, a luxury sedan, was parked in the reserved area. I got in, turned on the heater, and put on classical music to drown out the sound of the rain. I started the engine and headed out onto the coastal road, that road full of dangerous curves that hug the black stone cliffs. As I drove, my mind wandered between my professional triumph and my need to get home to take refuge in my sewing studio. I thought about what fabric I would use that night, perhaps silk, something soft to forget the hardship of the day. I wasn't thinking about God, I wasn't thinking about eternity. I wasn't thinking about the boy whose life I had just ruined with my signature. I was only thinking about myself. The rain lashed against the windshield so violently that the wipers couldn't keep up. The road was deserted and dark, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the thick fog. I was going fast, too fast. The confidence of the expert, they say. I knew that road by heart, every curve, every pothole. I was afraid, but the fear was waiting for me around the next curve. Suddenly, a strange mist, denser and darker than the rest, seemed to rise from the asphalt. It wasn't normal, it was like a solid wall. I felt a pressure in my chest. The same pressure I felt when the needle broke. My heart lurched. I gently pressed the brakes to slow down. But the car didn't respond. The steering wheel felt light, disconnected from the wheels. The car began to skid on the pooled water, aquaplaning. In that instant, time stretched. Everything happened in slow motion. I saw the metal guardrail approaching me. I saw the black abyss beyond the metal, and for the first time in my life, the judge had nothing to say. There was no valid objection, no law she could cite to stop physics. The impact was deafening. The metal crunched like paper. I felt the seatbelt dig into my chest, breaking ribs. The car crashed through the guardrail and hung suspended in the air for a second that seemed eternal. In that second of weightlessness, before falling into the void, I remembered the old woman. I remembered her sad eyes. "Seek Jesus Christ while he may be found." I wanted to scream, I wanted to beg for forgiveness, but my mouth wouldn't open. Pride sealed my lips until the very end, and then I fell. The fall wasn't into the sea, or at least not only into the sea. As my physical body plummeted toward the rocks and the icy water, my soul tore from my flesh. I didn't see the famous light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't see my deceased relatives coming to greet me with open arms. What I saw was darkness, a dense, heavy darkness that smelled of sulfur and rotten things, and I felt that touch, that first touch of something cold and scaly welcoming me to my new reality. The judge was dead. The sentence was now mine. The sound of an accident is something no one can describe in words. It's not just a crash, it's a cacophony of violence. I heard the metal of my luxury car screaming as it twisted, the tempered glass shattering into 1,000 pieces like a shower of killer diamonds, and the wet, muffled sound of my own body hitting the interior of the vehicle. All of that happened in a fraction of a second, but my mind, sharpened by terror, registered it all with terrifying clarity. I expected the water. I knew I was falling toward the sea. I expected the icy impact of the Pacific Ocean, the salt water filling my lungs, the desperate struggle to unbuckle my seatbelt and swim to the surface. I braced myself to drown. I tensed my muscles, waiting for the cold, but the water never came, and this is what I need you to understand, what I need to be etched in your minds. When we die, there is no fade to black, there is no moment of unconsciousness. The transition was instantaneous and terrifying. My car hit the rocks below. I know because I saw it, but I didn't stop with the car, while my physical body, that shell I cared for so much with expensive creams and designer clothes, was shattered between the iron and the stone. My true self, my consciousness, my spirit kept falling. I went through the floor of the car, through the rocks, through the water. Nothing physical could stop me. It was as if gravity had multiplied 1,000-fold. I was falling downwards, but not towards the bottom of the sea, but towards the center of the earth, towards a place that geographically shouldn't exist. Darkness swallowed me. It was no longer the darkness of a stormy night. It was a dense, palpable darkness, as if I were submerged in black ink. The wind I felt in this fall wasn't air, it was a gale of wailing. At first I thought it was the ringing in my ears from the trauma of the impact, but as I fell deeper and deeper, the sound became clear. They were screams, distant screams, millions of them, fused into a single, constant, despairing drone. The fear I felt in that descent is unmatched by anything on earth. In life we fear pain, losing money, loneliness, but there I felt the absolute fear of being completely unprotected. I didn't have my judge's robe, I didn't have my money, I didn't have my university degrees, I had no rights. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be spiritually naked. Suddenly, the fall stopped. I didn't land softly, but I didn't shatter either. I simply hit a surface and lay there, gasping for air that wasn't there. I lay motionless, my eyes closed, shaking violently. My rational mind searched for logical explanations. I'm in a coma, I thought. This is a hallucination brought on by the brain trauma. I'm in the hospital dreaming. I tried to cling to that idea. I told myself, wake up, Elena, wake up, but when I opened my eyes, I knew it wasn't a dream. The reality of that place was more vivid, sharper, and more horrifying than anything I had ever seen on Earth. There was no sunlight, no electric light. The place was bathed in a grayish, dirty gloom, like the sunset of a nuclear winter day. I could see, but everything lacked color. Everything was gray, black, brown, rotten, I sat up slowly. I looked at my hands. They were my hands, but they looked translucent, grayish, as if all life had drained from them. I touched my face, felt my skin, but it was cold, a chill that penetrated to the bone, a total absence of human warmth. I looked around and vomit rose in my throat. I wasn't in a hospital. I was in a vast, flat, and desolate valley. The ground wasn't solid earth, it was a kind of viscous, damp, and repulsive mud. When I placed my palm down to support myself, I felt the ground throb slightly, as if it were made of rotten meat or some other decomposing organic matter. It smelled of sulfur, old blood, and a clogged drain, a smell so pungent I could taste it on my tongue. "Hello?" I asked. My voice came out strangled, weak. No one answered with words, but the environment reacted. As I spoke, shadows moved in the periphery of my vision. Shapes I couldn't make out slipped away into the toxic haze that hovered just above the ground. I stood with difficulty, my seamstress's legs, accustomed to sitting for hours pedaling the machine, or my judge's legs beneath the bench, no longer supported me the same way. I felt heavy, as if I were wearing invisible chains. I took a few steps, my bare feet sinking into that disgusting substance. I looked for a way out, for a traffic sign, a door, a window, anything, but the horizon was infinite and monotonous. There was only desolation. Then I began to hear the whispers. They weren't coming from any specific direction, they were coming from everywhere. They seemed to rise from the ground itself. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." I turned sharply. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to reclaim my authority in the courtroom. "I'm Judge Elena Rivas. I demand to know where I am." My shout was swallowed by the fog. There was no echo on earth. My title used to make people tremble. Here, my title was a joke. The whispers changed. They no longer said guilty. They began to say more specific things, things no one knew: the money under the table, the innocent person you locked up, the lie to your mother, the pride, the pride. I covered my ears with my hands, but the whispers didn't enter them. They echoed directly inside my head. They were intrusive, violent, accusatory thoughts. I remembered all the times I mocked Christian testimonies. I remembered the old woman in the rain. God's justice sees everything. No, 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 I groaned, falling to my knees in the mud. This isn't real. God doesn't exist. Hell doesn't exist. I am a woman of science, of law. This is a delusion. But as I said it, a certainty as cold as steel settled in my heart. It was real, more real than the chair in my office, more real than the car I had just destroyed. I had died, and my soul had reached its destination. There was no fire around me yet, but the heat was suffocating, dry, unbearable. It was like being inside an unlit oven that retains the heat of 1,000 years. I felt a terrible thirst. My tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth. I would have given all my fortune, all my possessions, for a single drop of water, just one. I looked up, searching for the sky, searching for God, even if it was to insult him or to beg him, but there was no sky above. There was only a vault of black, oppressive rock that seemed to be slowly descending to crush us. There were no stars, no moon, no hope. I started walking aimlessly, crying, but my tears didn't soothe me. They burned my cheeks like acid. That's when I saw the others. At first, I thought they were mounds of earth or stones, but as I got closer, I saw that they were people, or what was left of them, huddled on the ground, gray, emaciated, their eyes wide with terror. Some were rocking back and forth, others were tearing at their hair, others were simply staring into space, mouths agape in a silent scream. I approached a man who was standing nearby. He seemed to be wearing a tattered suit, as if he had died long ago but was still wearing his funeral clothes or his work uniform. "Sir," I said, touching his shoulder, "please tell me where we are." The man turned slowly. His face was a mask of pure anguish. He had no eyes, only empty, dark sockets. But he looked at me. "We are where the worm does not die," he whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves breaking. "We are where time stands still. Welcome home, Judge." I stepped back, horrified. How did he know who I was? "I don't belong here," I stammered. "There was a mistake. I am a good citizen. I obeyed the law." The man let out a dry, horrible laugh. The law mocked. Here, the only law is pain and paying for what we did. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something moving beneath the mud, something large. The other souls nearby began to scream and scatter, crawling like frightened insects. "It's coming," a woman shouted from afar. "Hide." I didn't know it was coming, but my survival instinct, or what was left of it, kicked in. I tried to run, but the mud became stickier, trapping my ankles. It was as if the ground wanted to deliver me, and then I felt it again, that feeling on my skin, the same one I felt in my sewing workshop when the needle broke, that cold, dry touch of invisible scales passing near me. The air grew heavy, a hissing sound filled the valley, drowning out the cries. It wasn't an ordinary snake. The sound was so deep it made my broken ribs, or the memory of them, vibrate. I froze, alone in the mist, as the shadows parted to reveal something creeping closer, something ancient, something that knew me by name. Regret began to sprout within me, but it wasn't genuine regret yet. It was remorse, it was panic. I wanted to go back. I wanted 5 more minutes on earth to kneel and beg for forgiveness. I wanted to change my sentence against that boy. I wanted to hear the old woman speak, but time had run out. The door of grace seemed to have closed behind me with the sound of my car's twisting metal. Now I was alone, and the owner of those scales had come to collect. Fear has levels. On earth, we think we know fear when we lose our jobs, when we receive a medical diagnosis, or when we walk down a dark street. But that's not real fear, that's anxiety. True fear, biblical and absolute fear, is what I felt when I understood that my will no longer belonged to me. In that place, your will is the first thing they take from you. I lay there with my knees sunk in that nauseating mud, unable to get up. I tried to stand, I tried to regain my judge's posture, that straight back that intimidated defense attorneys, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if gravity in that place were a giant hand crushing me against the ground. I realized with horror that in this valley of shadows, no one could stand. Upright posture, the dignity of a human being who walks erect, was forbidden. Here we were all worms, we all had to crawl. The landscape around me cleared a little, not from light, but because my dead eyes grew accustomed to the gloom. What at first seemed like an empty desert now revealed itself as a moving mass grave. The ground didn't tremble from earthquakes. It trembled because it was covered with millions of souls. As far as the eye could see, gray, twisted bodies moved slowly over one another, like a mass of larvae in an open wound. The smell was the worst. In my sewing workshop, I sometimes used vinegar to set colors or clean stains, and the strong smell made me wrinkle my nose. But this was the concentrated smell of every sin committed in history. It smelled of betrayal, it smelled of violence, it smelled of lies. The air itself was toxic. Every time I inhaled, it felt as if I was swallowing hot, ground glass. My lungs, though no longer biological, burned with a chemical fire. I coughed, trying to expel that air, but I only inhaled more. It was a cycle of suffocation that never ended in unconsciousness. Then, the hissing I had heard before transformed. It was no longer an ambient sound, it became words. They didn't come from one person, they came from everywhere. They seemed to sprout from the cracks in the ground, from the black rocks, from the mouths of the other damned. It was a chorus of millions of low, rapid, and malicious voices. I call it the Well of Whispers, because there were no thunderous screams in that specific area, only a constant, maddening murmur, like the buzzing of a swarm of wasps inside your brain. Unjust judge, corrupt judge, you thought you were a goddess, you thought you were the law. The voices knew my life better than I did. They began reciting articles of law that I had morally violated. Article of pride, guilty. Article of greed, guilty. Article of lack of mercy, guilty. I covered my ears tightly, pressing my hands against my head until I felt my skull was going to explode, but it was useless. The whispers weren't sound waves, they were telepathic transmissions of pure hatred. They seeped through my fingers, through my pores. Enough! I screamed, my voice breaking. Silence in the courtroom. Order. It was pathetic. My attempt to impose authority provoked a reaction from those around me. The whispers stopped for a second and then erupted into a collective laugh, a cold, dry, joyless laugh. They were laughing at my illusion of power. On Earth, I had a wooden mallet, I would bang it on the table, and the world would fall silent. Here, I was less than nothing. A woman crawled close to me, her face was contorted with pain, but I recognized something in her eyes. The same despair I felt grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her long, dirty nails dug into my spectral skin. "There is no order here," she hissed in my face with breath that smelled of sulfur. "Here, there is only memory. You don't hear them, they are reading your sentence." I pushed away from her, filled with disgust. Pride still lived within me. Even in hell, I didn't want to be touched. I didn't want to be part of that mass. I was Elena Rivas. I had a mansion facing the sea. I sewed dresses of imported silk. I didn't belong in this garbage dump. But reality hit me again. I looked at my clothes. I was no longer wearing my immaculate black toga or my designer coat. I was wearing dirty, grey rags, stained with that viscous substance from the ground. They looked like poorly applied mummy bandages. My vanity, my shield, had vanished. I tried to crawl forward, searching for a way out of that valley. My seamstress's hands, which I always took such care not to snag the fine fabrics, now sank into the filth. I felt things moving under my palms, insects or things that looked like insects. They bit me. I felt sharp pricks, like hot needles piercing my fingertips, but I didn't bleed. It just hurt. It hurt with an intensity that made me cry, but my tears evaporated before they hit the ground because of the heat. As I crawled, the whispers changed in tone. They became more specific. They began to speak of things I had buried deep in my subconscious. They reminded me of the day my mother died. I was too busy with an important case to go see her in the hospital in her final hours. She died alone, calling my name. The whispers, they repeated her last words in her own voice. "Elena, daughter, come here." "No," I wept, pounding the ground. "I had a job. It was important. Work was your idol. Your mother died alone. Selfish, selfish." The emotional pain was worse than the physical. On Earth, we can distract ourselves. We turn on the television, drink a glass of wine, go down to the basement to sew, work late. We have ways to numb our conscience, but in hell there are no distractions, no sleep, no rest. You are alone with your naked truth, and that truth tortures you relentlessly. I understood then that fire is not the only torment in this place. Memory is a fire, guilt is a worm that eats you from the inside and is never satisfied. I kept crawling, fleeing the voices until I reached the edge of what looked like a precipice in the valley. I looked down, and vertigo made me dizzy. It wasn't an empty abyss. Below, in the profound darkness, red glows like embers from a distant fire could be seen, and louder cries could be heard, shrieks of unbearable physical pain. But what stopped me wasn't the abyss, but what I saw on the other side. Far, far away, I saw a crack in the black stone sky, a tiny crack, almost invisible, and through that crack I saw a light. It wasn't the grey light of this place, it was a pure light, golden, white, a light that conveyed a peace I had never known. For a second, my dead heart leapt. "Hope, there," I cried, "is a way out." I tried to get up again, driven by the sight of that light, but as soon as I fixed my eyes on it, I felt a brutal weight on my shoulders. An invisible claw crushed me against the mud. "It's not for you," the whispers said, this time in unison, like a chorus of judges delivering their final verdict. "That light is for those who have been cleansed. You are stained, you are dirty." The light faded, the crack closed, and the darkness returned. The sense of loss was devastating. It was like dying a second time, to know that salvation exists, to know that heaven is real, that peace is real, but that you are forever excluded, is the greatest torment a soul can suffer. It is the definition of damnation, to see glory from afar and know that you will never be able to touch it. I collapsed. I stopped fighting. I lay in the mud, sobbing without comfort. "Why?" I asked the void. I was a woman of the law. I maintained order. I didn't kill anyone with my hands. A different voice answered. It wasn't a whisper. It was a deep, resonant voice that made my bones tremble. "You killed the truth," the voice said. You killed mercy and made yourself a god in your own image and resemblance. I raised my head, searching for the source of that voice. The air in front of me began to swirl, the fog thickened and took on a tall, immense, cylindrical shape. Fear returned, but this time, it was mixed with a terrifying respect. I knew I was before a real authority, not a borrowed one like mine, but an ancient and malevolent one. The ground stopped vibrating, the other condemned souls remained in absolute silence, pressed to the ground, trying to make themselves invisible. The whispers ceased abruptly, even the wailing wind stopped. All of hell seemed to hold its breath. I was in the center of an empty circle. I felt like the accused stepping onto the stand, alone and vulnerable, while the prosecutor slowly approaches to destroy him. But here there was no defense attorney, no jury, only me and the darkness taking shape. I remembered my workshop, I remembered how I liked to untangle the knots of the thread. I thought, if only I could find the thread of my life, if only I could go back and untie the knot of my pride. But the thread was cut, the fabric torn, the form before me solidified. It wasn't a man, not a demon with bat wings like they paint in picture medieval. It was something far more primal, something that awakened an ancestral terror in my reptilian brain. I saw the scales first. They were enormous, the size of dinner plates, black as onyx, but with an oily, iridescent sheen that reflected sickly colors, rotten green, purplish violet. It loomed over me, blocking what little visibility I had. It was a column of muscle and power. Then it lowered its head, two yellow, slanted, vertical eyes fixed on me. They were intelligent eyes that had witnessed the dawn of humanity and its fall. Eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. It wasn't a mindless monster, it was the serpent, the ancient one, and it was looking at me not as an enemy, but as property. I felt my mind shatter. The inner judge, that critical and logical voice that had accompanied me all my life, disintegrated. Only Elena remained, little Elena, terrified, naked before absolute evil. The serpent opened its mouth, not to bite me, but to speak, but its language wasn't human words, its language was vibration. I felt its voice resonate in my chest, manipulating the beats of my phantom heart. It slithered toward me. The sound of its body slithering through the mud was hypnotic. SHH, SHH. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I was compelled to look. I was compelled to see whom I had truly served my entire life. I thought I served the law, I thought I served the state, but every time I was arrogant, every time I crushed a poor person with my mallet, every time I ignored God to worship myself, I was serving her. She was my true master, and now she had come to claim her disciple. The creature began to circle me, her immense body formed a ring around me, blocking my path, isolating me from the rest of hell. I was trapped in her circle. The scent emanating from her was intoxicating and repulsive at the same time. She smelled of musk and sweet poison. "Welcome, Elena," the snake whispered, and this time it did use words that slithered into my mind like black silkworms. "I have waited a long time for this embrace." I realized the trial was over before it even began. The sentence had already been passed, and the execution was about to begin. A snake's embrace is not like a blow. A blow is honest, it hurts, and it ends. A constrictor's embrace is a slow promise of destruction. It is a perverse intimacy. When that colossal creature began to coil around me, the first thing I felt was not pain, but an absolute cold that pierced my soul. It was an intelligent cold, a cold that sought to extinguish any spark of hope that might remain within me. The scales brushed against my bare arms. They were as hard as steel, but had a repulsive, slippery texture, coated in a kind of ancient oil. The sound of its body sliding over itself to create the first ring around me was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. It was the sound of a cell closing forever. I froze, paralyzed by fear, not the fear that makes you scream, but the fear that freezes you, the one that turns you into a statue. My instincts as a judge, those that served me to dominating a room full of aggressive lawyers, they vanished. There was no law that to protect me, no one to call on. I was alone with the beast. The serpent was in no hurry. It knew I couldn't escape. It moved with a terrible elegance, closing the circle inch by inch. I felt the first squeeze on my ankles. It was gentle at first, almost like a caress, but with undeniable firmness it trapped my legs, immobilizing them. Then the thick, muscular body continued to rise, encircling my hips, my waist, my chest. It was like being trapped in a living vice. "I know you, Elena," the voice vibrated in my head, resonating in my bones. "I know the taste of your pride. I've eaten from your plate for years." The creature raised its gigantic head and,